It's little more than a historical footnote in a long list of horrors and atrocities committed during the Holocaust, but there was a little-known uprising that took place in one of the death camps that was located in Poland. At Sobibor, the Nazis had expanded the camp twice to manage the larger number of executions that they wanted to handle there in Poland. An estimated 250,000 Jews were executed at Sobibor. In one of the only successful uprisings in any of the camps, on October 14, 1943, under the leadership of Leon Feldenhelder, they launched a surprise attack against the guards, captured the garrison, and about 300 of the prisoners managed to escape and not be recaptured. One man who did survive the escape described the events of the uprising, and he said that he obtained a bayonet, broke into one of the Nazi officers' offices, and went up to him and began stabbing him. This is for my father. This is for my mother. This is for my brother. Within minutes, nearly all of the Nazi soldiers who were so confident in their control of the camp lay dead. They lay dead from the hands of people that they thought were passive prisoners, people they were so superior over, that they controlled, that they dominated, that they exploited. Chris Hedges, a columnist for Truthdig, brought up this bit of history about Sobibor in an article about what's been going on in Baltimore this week, saying that our violence comes back to us. The man who repeatedly stabbed a Nazi officer was not an evil man. And from the distance of 70 years of history, when you heard me tell the story, you probably felt no judgment of him. You felt no fear of him, no disdain. You might even identify with him, feel like you would applaud that act of violence. It's much more difficult in the present moment when angry mobs of protesters are throwing rocks at riot-geared police, looting stores, setting fire to police cars and buildings, to be able to see that this is not a mere moment in history. This is not a reaction to the death of one young black man who was arrested without cause or provocation and then treated so roughly in police custody that his spine was broken in two. The death of Freddie Gray in police custody was a spark that ignited a powder keg that had been building for 50 years. But for a moment, let me just lift up this one case of Freddie Gray's death as an example of how that powder keg has been built. He was a black young man in a neighborhood known for crime, and thus an area where there was consistently aggressive policing. It's just been the rule. He made eye contact with a policeman, and in a moment of fear, he turned and ran, and that was as close as he came to committing a crime. The police gave chase, called for assistance. He was apprehended, and they found a pocket knife in his pocket. And men and women, I don't want to alarm you, but I have a pocket knife in my pocket. I do every single Sunday. You've never seen me here without a pocket knife in my pocket. And as Bill Murray once said, I was in the Swiss Army, and you should not take that lightly, because in the Swiss Army, they teach you how to kill with a little tiny pair of scissors. We are dangerous people. The knife in Freddie Gray's pocket was not a switchblade. It was not an illegal weapon. It was the kind of thing that we use to cut string and open boxes every day of our lives. And you will have heard that he was handcuffed and thrown in the back of a police van without any restraint, without a seatbelt. And that may not sound all that bad to you, but let me tell you, several multi-million-dollar lawsuits have already been paid by the city of Baltimore for the practice of putting someone in handcuffs where they can't control where their body goes, then they throw them in the back of a metal van and give them what is called a rough ride. Sudden stops, turns, and acceleration that throws the handcuffed person around, beating them without ever having to lay a hand on them. In 2004, Jeffrey Alston won a $39 million judgment against Baltimore from being paralyzed in a rough ride. In 2005, Donde Johnson Sr. won $7.4 million because his rough ride in a police van left him a paraplegic. More recently, Christine Abbott has filed suit for a rough ride she was being given after being arrested for a noise complaint from a neighbor. Because of these lawsuits, the city has mandated that all suspects be secured in seatbelts, but the police often don't follow this protocol when they want to rough someone up. In the case of Freddie Gray, once he had been injured, he repeatedly asked for medical attention. Some 6 different officers saw him, knew that he was in distress, and refused to respond with medical aid. You wonder why these demonstrations so often turn violent. Why would they burn down a store in their own neighborhood? Why would they attack the police? Well, these horrible problems have existed for decades, and in spite of protests, lawsuits, and even songs and movies being made about the conditions in the bad neighborhoods of Baltimore, nothing happened and little public attention was given to it until they set fire to a CVS store. Our violence comes back to us eventually. You can almost say that it always comes back to us. If we consistently, over the years, oppress a group of people with violent conduct, it will come back. And yet, when it happens, we're always surprised. If you remember, even when the Iranian embassy was taken over, when was that? 1977, 78, 79? Americans were just shocked. Why would they do that to an embassy? Why don't we drop bombs on it? There was no awareness that our CIA had conducted a secret war in Iran, killing 60,000 people to keep the Shah in power. We always act like these things happen in a vacuum. Nothing happens in a vacuum. This riot that broke out in Baltimore was years in the coming. Speaking to the American Psychological Association in 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King was trying to speak to this professional psychological association about why so many of the civil rights demonstrations turned into riots. And this is a longer quote than I would normally read, but it's so good. Let me read 3 paragraphs. King said, "A profound judgment of today's riots was expressed by Victor Hugo a century ago. He said, 'If a soul is left in the darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. The policymakers of the white society have caused the darkness. They create discrimination. They structured the slums. They perpetuated unemployment, ignorance, and poverty. It is incontestable and deplorable that Negroes have committed crimes, but they are derivative crimes. They are born of the greater crimes of the white society. When we ask Negroes to abide by the law, let us also demand that the white man abide by the laws in the ghetto. Day in and day out, he violates welfare laws to deprive the poor of their meager allotments. He flagrantly violates building codes and regulations. His police make a mockery of the law. He violates laws on equal employment and education and provisions for civic services. The slums are the handiwork of a vicious system of a white society. Negroes live in them because they do not make them any more than a prisoner makes a prison. Let us say boldly that if the violations of law by the white man in the slums over the years were calculated and compared with the law-breaking of a few days of riots, the hardened criminal would be the white man. Now, that being said, it's important to note that while the victim in this case was black, 3 of the 6 police now charged with murder are also black. Most of the divide in Martin Luther King's day looked like a black community abused by a white community. But much of what we see in Baltimore, what we see in New York, what we see in Los Angeles, is a division between people who have power against people who don't have power. People who are now prisoners of fear, prisoners of economic deprivation, joblessness, and schools that are absolutely nothing but babysitting services. It is still largely white and black in Baltimore, but it's not all about race. I've been in contact this week with Rebecca Bark, who is a teacher, former member of our church, who now lives with her 2 children in an apartment in Baltimore where she teaches in a private school. She asked me to tell you that the media's portrayal of the riots have been extreme, playing the burning of the CVS store in a continuous loop long after the fire had been put out. And almost everything that you saw in the news took place in one intersection, when you could go for miles around Baltimore and see burnt-out buildings and vacant houses that have been there for decades. Most of the demonstrations have been peaceful, and the city, though sharply divided between black and white areas, poor and middle class, she says the city is coming together. And unlike Boston, unlike New York, Baltimore is ready to change. The media actually provoked some of the violence. You may have seen angry demonstrators yelling at Geraldo, telling him to leave, that the TV cameras themselves were provoking acts of violence. And so the media bears a lot of blame for the misrepresentation of the entire city, as well as a failure to represent what was really provoking the demonstrations. Still, the abuses have been real, and they've been long-term, stemming all the way back from a riot that broke out in Baltimore the day that Martin Luther King was murdered. The victims of abusive policing have rarely had a voice. Most of the time, we never hear about those who've died in police custody, but even the ones that we have heard about, the officers in question are virtually never found guilty of their crimes. It was 1991, first time that video cameras were becoming fairly readily available, that lots of private citizens had video cameras. And a man shot a video of the aggressive arrest of Rodney King. And so there were charges brought against the police that pulled him over and beat him half to death. But they were all acquitted. But time after time, even when there's been video, officers have been acquitted. The shooting of Walter Scott in Charleston last month was the first time in my recent memory that it was different. The offending officer was immediately fired and has been charged with murder. And I don't see any way out of his conviction. Still, it may surprise you to know that I'm not typically a very emotional man. I don't cry easily. Mostly, if you see tears, it's allergies. But I was stopped on the sidewalk this week by my own emotions. I listened to a lot of news podcasts while I exercise, and I'd never heard of her before, but I have to tell you, I'm in love, and I've never felt this way before. I mean it this time. Baltimore State Attorney, what a heartthrob. Marilyn Mosby, doggone it, she's married. And this 35-year-old state's prosecuting attorney has brought murder charges against the 6 officers involved in the death of Freddie Gray, and did it fairly quickly. Her decision to charge these officers moved much faster than the wheels of government typically turn, but something needed to happen to stop the demonstrations in Baltimore. And so she and her staff literally worked around the clock to get these charges brought out as quickly as possible, to give the people in Baltimore a chance to believe that maybe justice could happen. She confidently, and I would say lovingly, stood in a public forum and said, "I've heard your cries of no justice, no peace. Now I have to ask you for your peace to give us a chance to give you justice." And I don't know how that felt in the hearts of the people standing around her in Baltimore, but it brought tears to my eyes. I could hardly maintain composure because I believed her. I hope she doesn't disappoint me, and I hope she doesn't disappoint Baltimore, but I found what she said to be compelling and real and honest. Whatever faith I've had in America's justice system has been beaten up pretty badly these past few years, but I believe that she means business and that Marilyn Mosby will defend the interests of the demonstrators in Baltimore. But you know, violence doesn't end violence. Hate doesn't end hate. Ultimately, you know, there really is nothing to revenge. There's no such thing as revenge. All there is retaliatory counterattacks, because what feels like revenge to you feels like an attack to them. And so it can go back and forth without end. Martin Luther King is famous for having said, "Darkness doesn't drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hatred doesn't drive out hatred, only love can do that." On this day when we read from the Apostle of Love, St. John's first letter, in which he insists that his readers understand that God is love and that any true worship, any true religion, any true faith is love at its root. Now that may sound silly and solipsistic, but as obvious as it should be, we have to separate that word from its association with lust. Love is not adolescent pheromones calling out to one another. Love is not adoration or desire. Love is not hunger that seeks to be consumed or filled. Love, I really need for you to lean forward into this definition with me. To love someone is to desire, to work for, and to be willing to sacrifice for the well-being of someone else, regardless of what comes back to you. Love is not personal fulfillment. That's lust. That's greed. Love is wanting someone else's fulfillment, their best self, their growth, their accomplishment of what lies before them. Love is an earnest, deep investment in the well-being of another person. It's not just an opinion. It is certainly not just a feeling. It is a sacrifice for the benefit of another. For many years, I've had a framed poster of Che Guevara's quote on my wall that reads, "The true revolutionary is motivated by love." Now, none of us here would want to support all of Che Guevara's methods in his revolution. But I think in light of Ferguson, in light of New York, North Charleston, Baltimore, I would invite you to see if you can feel what Che meant when he said, "If you tremble with indignation at every injustice, then you are a comrade of mine." If you can hear about these injustices, these deaths at the hands of police, and not tremble with indignation, then you haven't understood yet what it means to actually love anyone, or to make the claim that we make here so often, that love is our religion, because love is not a religion that resides inside your skull. It can't be just a warm feeling that you have in your heart. It has to be a passion that drives you to action. There are two things that perpetuate crime: poverty and a lack of education. Where there is poverty and poor education, there will be excessive policing, and violence, men and women, always comes back to us. Always. So for Trayvon, for Michael Brown, for Tamir Rice, for Walter Scott, for Freddie Gray, and for all of the frightened, hardened, hopeless, angry victims of the violence of poverty, locked in a dark, dark city where the light of education is blotted out for all of them, for all of us, we choose love. Love that demands action, sacrifice, and investment. That before we invade another foreign country, we rebuild our schools. Before we invade another country, we give jobs in the blighted urban centers. Love that means we will not waste trillions of dollars just giving tax breaks to the very wealthy and invading other countries. We will not watch our cities crumble. We will not tolerate cuts in education to build more prisons and give tax breaks to the wealthy. We will not act like wallowing in some narcissistic religion that is nothing but pie in the sky and the by and by is enough for people trapped in violence and ignorance. No more syrupy superstitions and platitudes backed up by nothing but magical thinking. Neither Santa Claus nor Harry Potter will ever fix what is wrong with our nation. Only the real thing can, and you have to want it.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.